When we hear the name ancient Greece today, we immediately picture the marble columns of the Parthenon, wise men debating philosophy and tragedies being performed in grand theaters. It is remembered as the birthplace of Western civilization, the cradle of art and science. But behind this magnificent image lies a much darker truth. The Greek world was not one unified empire, but rather a mosaic of small city-states, poleis, such as Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes. Each had its own laws and customs. Yet they all shared one defining feature: the ideals of freedom and equality applied only to a privileged minority. Athens, so proud of its democracy, granted political rights only to free male citizens. Women, foreigners, and slaves were excluded. Sparta, celebrated for its disciplined warriors, built its society on the backs of countless enslaved people. Slavery was not an exception in Greece. It was the foundation of society itself. In some cities, 30 or even 40% of the population were slaves. This meant that 1 out of every 3 individuals lived without freedom. The prosperity of a citizen was made possible only through another's chains. And how were slaves regarded? They were seen as objects. A master's property, no different from a table, a chair, or a horse. Aristotle himself declared, "Some men are slaves by nature." This chilling statement reveals how deeply ingrained and legitimized slavery was in Greek thought. The lives of slaves varied. Some worked the fields from sunrise to sunset. Others toiled in mines, dark, suffocating tunnels that often became their graves. Domestic slaves served in kitchens and chambers, raising the children of their masters. And then there were the concubines. This was the most vulnerable and intimate form of slavery. Female concubines were used to satisfy their master's desires, yet less known is the fact that male concubines also existed. Many were captured as boys, sold in slave markets, and brought into the houses of wealthy men. Behind the gleaming marble of ancient Greece stood these hidden lives. While citizens sang hymns to freedom, slaves suffered in silence. And among them, male concubines were perhaps the most forgotten, the most tragic of all. To understand their story, we must first accept a harsh reality. The grandeur of ancient Greece was built upon slave labor. Without slaves, philosophers could not spend endless hours in debate, and artists could not sculpt their masterpieces. The so-called cradle of liberty was, in truth, one of the most systematic slave societies in history. And within that contradiction lies the tragic life of the male concubine. The story of a male concubine often began in an instant. Just yesterday, he might have been a child playing in his mother's arms, yet the next day he could find himself dragged away in chains, stripped of freedom forever. In ancient Greece, there were many paths into slavery, but they all ended the same way: the loss of liberty. The most common path was war. The Greek city-states were constantly at each other's throats: Athens against Sparta, Corinth against Thebes, Greeks against Persians. At the end of every battle, hundreds, sometimes thousands of people were taken captive. Among them were women and children, and young boys in particular were highly prized in the slave markets, for they were young enough to serve their masters for many years to come. Another path was piracy. Across the restless waves of the Aegean Sea, pirate ships prowled like predators. They raided coastal villages, burning homes and abducting people. For those who lived by the shore, the fear was ever present. One morning you might wake to see your village in flames, your children chained aboard a pirate galley. Many of these children would never again see their families. Slavery could also come through debt. A poor father, unable to pay what he owed, might be forced to sell his son to a slave trader. This practice was not uncommon in both Greek cities and neighboring lands. A boy's life could suddenly become nothing more than the price of a debt. Then there were those born into bondage, The child of a slave mother was automatically considered a slave. This ensured that slavery carried on from generation to generation. Even when a concubine bore a child to her master, that child was considered his property, never free, always owned. The heart of this cruel system was the slave market. In large cities, the trade was thriving. Chained men, women, and children were lined up before potential buyers, their bodies inspected, their strength, health, and beauty assessed. The fate of a boy destined to become a concubine was often decided right there under the gaze of strangers. The young, the handsome, the healthy fetched the highest prices because their masters saw them not only as servants, but also as objects of desire. Imagine the scene. A child stands trembling in the marketplace, clutching to hope. A wealthy man passes by, his eyes linger, and with a simple gesture, he says, "I'll take this one." In that instant, the boy's world collapses. His name may be stripped away, his identity erased. A new master, a new house, but no freedom. Only a fate written in chains. To be a slave in ancient Greece was cruel enough, but to be a male concubine was a far heavier burden, for his body was not bought solely for labor, but for pleasure, and that condemned him to a life even harsher, even more tragic than that of the ordinary slave. In the world of ancient Greece, slavery was not only about labor, it was also inseparably tied to sexuality. And it was here that the tragedy of the male concubine truly began. For they were not used merely for housework or field labor, but also for the desires of their masters. Relationships between men in Greek society were accepted in ways that feel completely foreign to us today. The most well-known form of this was the practice of pederasty. Pederasty referred to a special bond between an older man and a younger boy. It was often framed as an educational relationship. The elder provided knowledge, guidance, and social connections. Yet, alongside this mentorship, there was also a sexual component. Society did not fully condemn such relationships. In fact, in many city-states, they were tolerated, so long as they followed certain rules. But there was a crucial distinction. When a free boy engaged willingly, it could even be seen as prestigious. For slaves, however, the situation was entirely different. Male concubines were the most vulnerable participants in this culture, for they had no choice at all. A male concubine might be taken into his master's bed before even reaching adolescence. For these children, it was not education, but open exploitation. Yet, in ancient Greek society, their feelings, their consent, and their suffering did not matter. They were property, and their masters could treat them however they wished. Some sources describe how male concubines were specially groomed and adorned. Their hair was oiled and combed, fine garments were placed upon them. This reveals that they were not regarded as ordinary household slaves, but rather as luxury objects. Masters could even display them to guests, or use them as part of their entertainments. Here lies the central tragedy. While Greek philosophers exalted freedom, virtue, and justice, at the very same time countless enslaved children were being used in this way. While Plato's ideals were being debated, concubines were quietly shedding tears in silence. For free youths, pederasty was considered only a temporary stage. Once a boy matured, such relationships were expected to end. But for slave concubines, there was no escape. Their bodies remained at the disposal of their masters for as long as they were desired. Many spent their entire youth consumed in this way. Imagine it, a child still at an age when he should be playing, reduced instead to an object of amusement. Living each day in fear, unable to escape his master's gaze, robbed of all control over his own life. This was the deepest wound in the life of the male concubine. In Greek art and literature, love was celebrated as something noble and eternal. Yet the suffering of slave concubines remained hidden in the shadows of history. Their voices were rarely recorded, for no one wished to preserve their cries. But the fragments that survive tell us this. Behind the grand marble columns of the ancient world lay a forgotten and tragic reality. In ancient Greece, male concubines were not kept only for hidden desires. Their lives also played an important role in the daily order of households and palaces. Slavery was, in many ways, the backbone of Greek society. The wealth of great families, the order of vast estates, and the splendor of royal courts all rested on the shoulders of slaves. Male concubines were an inseparable part of this system. Their duties within households varied greatly. Some assisted cooks in the kitchen, prepared meals, and poured wine at the table. Others were tasked with cleaning and maintaining the home. Yet some bore far more intimate responsibilities, serving as their master's personal attendant. This meant combing his hair, helping him dress, even washing him in the baths. In these moments, the line between master and concubine nearly disappeared. In wealthy families, male concubines were sometimes made caretakers of children. Thus, a boy who had lost his own childhood was forced to become a companion, tutor's assistant, or guardian to his master's children. This was one of the many tragic contradictions of their lives. In palaces, their role became even more pronounced. Kings, tyrants, and great aristocrats displayed them almost as ornaments. They were dressed with care, groomed to impress, and presented before guests. At lavish banquets, their presence was essential. They poured wine, danced to music, and were often used in the private entertainments of the night. Male concubines were also seen as instruments of trust. Because they were not free, they were completely dependent on their masters. This made them ideal for handling delicate matters. A concubine might carry secret letters, attend private meetings, or guard his master's confidences. Their loyalty was not a choice. It was enforced by their bondage. Yet behind all these roles lay the same painful truth. Concubines never owned their lives. In the eyes of their masters, they were not fully human, but objects. Like furniture within a house or palace, they were expected simply to exist in silence until called upon. Historians note that some male concubines managed to gain favor and enjoyed slightly better conditions. They were given finer clothes, better food, even small authority over other slaves. A few became favorite slaves, elevated above the rest. But this never meant freedom. A single mistake, or even a whim of the master, could bring brutal punishment in an instant. Picture it, the grandeur of a palace banquet, philosophers debating lofty ideals, music and dance filling the halls, while in the corner stood a silent concubine waiting only for his master's glance. His smile was forced, his silence a scream etched into history. The palaces and mansions of ancient Greece may still stand today, their marble walls enduring through centuries. But the tragedy of the male concubines who once lived behind those walls is largely forgotten. We see only the brilliance of the past, rarely noticing the shadows that gave it form. And it is in those shadows that the true role of the concubine is revealed, a reminder of the darkness beneath the splendor. In ancient Greece, male concubines were not merely slaves or servants. They were also symbols of their master's power. The number of concubines a man possessed and the degree of their obedience could be a source of pride. Owning slaves was not just an economic privilege, it was also a marker of political and social prestige. At the heart of the master-concubine relationship lay absolute obedience. A concubine could not disobey, could not resist, and could not even voice his own opinion. Many sources describe how concubines were whipped or subjected to severe punishments for the smallest mistakes. These punishments were not only meant to cause pain, but also to serve as warnings to the others. The master's authority was unquestionable, his word was law. But the relationship was not only about one-sided dominance. What made it even more complex and often more tragic was that concubines sometimes developed emotional bonds with their masters. Taken as children, torn away from their families and past, these boys were raised to know only their master. For them, the master could be both a cruel tyrant and the only figure of attachment in their lives. This psychological dependency deepened their bondage, binding them not just with chains, but with emotions. Young male concubines, in particular, were seen by some masters not merely as servants, but as objects of pleasure. Here, sexuality became the rawest expression of power. The concubine's consent was irrelevant, only the master's desire mattered. In this way, their very bodies became instruments of dominance. Their existence was transformed into proof of their master's authority. At times, concubines could even become their master's most trusted confidants. Kings or aristocrats might rely on them in political intrigues, using them to carry secret letters, serve at private meetings, or witness intimate conversations. Their dependency made them seem trustworthy. But this trust was perilous, for if a concubine failed to keep a secret, the punishment could be death. Power was maintained not only through violence and obedience, but also through fear. Concubines lived under the constant threat of punishment. A single word, a glance, or a misstep could cost them their lives. This fear carved deep scars into their souls. What we now call trauma bonding in psychology was present in its starkest form in the slave-master relationships of ancient Greece. Historical records suggest that some concubines became favorites in the eyes of their masters. They were given finer clothes, better meals, even privileges over other slaves. But even this was another layer of the power game. Masters often fueled rivalry among their concubines, turning them against one another. Hierarchies emerged. Some gained small advantages, while others were pushed further down. Picture it. Inside a grand chamber of a palace, a powerful aristocrat sits at the head of the table, surrounded by obedient slaves and concubines. Everything in that room seems to belong to him. Yet, perhaps the greatest tragedy in that room is not the display of wealth or power, but the silence of a concubine who dares not lift his gaze. His fear, his enforced muteness, remains one of history's most painful legacies. The master-concubine relationship exposes not only the social, but also the moral structure of ancient Greece. What to them seemed natural would be unthinkable to us today. But history reminds us that what is accepted as natural is not always just nor humane. The tragedy of the male concubine stands as one of the clearest proofs of this truth. In ancient Greece, the life of male concubines, despite the glittering splendor of palaces or aristocratic households, was in truth a life filled with hardship and soul-crushing monotony. Their every day was lived in discipline, obedience, and uncertainty. The day often began before sunrise. Concubines were required to wake before their masters. Their first tasks included cleaning the house or palace, preparing their master's clothes, and ensuring the order of meals. If the master belonged to an aristocratic family, the concubine was also responsible for waking the male children at dawn, attending to their bathing and clothing needs. The smallest mistake during these duties could result in harsh punishment. Meal times were among the most stressful moments of the day. In ancient Greece, the arrangement of the table carried deep ritual significance. Wine cups had to be filled correctly, bread carefully sliced, and if guests were present, service had to be flawless. Concubines were not only expected to serve, but were also closely observed. A single oversight could spark the anger of both the master and his guests. The rest of the day varied in duties. Some concubines worked as scribes in libraries, others engaged in music or poetry, while many were tasked with purely physical labor. Eunuchs, in particular, were often entrusted with the most intimate responsibilities, attending to women, overseeing private chambers, or carrying confidential documents. They were considered their master's most reliable slaves. Yet outside of their tasks, concubines had almost no time for their own lives. Freedom was nothing more than a dream. Leaving the household was usually forbidden. They could not shop on their own, make friends, or communicate with their families. Most had been torn from their homes at a young age, and over time even their memories of the past faded away. When night fell, the most tense hours began. These were the moments when their masters could summon them. A concubine could be pulled from his bed and taken to the private chambers of his master. Sometimes it was simply for service, pouring wine, delivering a document. But most often it meant something else. The concubine could not refuse his master's sexual demands. This was the darkest aspect of daily life. The greatest uncertainty in a concubine's existence was the absence of a future. Their fate was entirely at the mercy of their master's will. If treated well, they might remain in the same household for years and perhaps, in rare cases, be freed in old age. But for most, this was nothing more than a fragile hope. Few ever gained freedom. Most spent their lives in their master's home, only to vanish quietly into obscurity. How did concubines interact with one another? They could share brief conversations with other slaves in the household or palace, yet even these exchanges had to be cautious, for some slaves acted as informants. The slightest remark displeasing to the master could lead to swift punishment. True friendships were rare. Most concubines lived in profound loneliness. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of daily life was the absence of hope. A male concubine lived each day knowing nothing would ever change. Rise early, serve flawlessly, meet the master's demands, avoid punishment, and repeat the same cycle the next day. This routine dragged on for years until the concubine became weary, broken, and forgotten, and yet some tried to keep their spirits alive through art or faith. A few composed poetry, others whispered secret prayers, and some preserved small symbols of their past in defiance of oblivion. A stone from their village, a scrap of cloth from their family, such tokens became their only sources of comfort. The daily life of concubines reveals the bitter truth hidden behind the grandeur of ancient Greece. History books often celebrate kings' victories or philosophers' great ideas. But the nameless lives that paid the price for such glory are too often forgotten. Male concubines stand as one of the starkest examples of these silenced lives. At the end of the day, their only hope was this. Perhaps one day they might be freed by their master. Perhaps one day they might live again as free men. But for most, that hope never became reality. Their daily lives remain condemned to the quietest and most tragic pages of history. In ancient Greek society, the fate of male concubines was not limited to servitude alone. Their bodies, too, were considered the property of their masters. For this reason, one of the most brutal realities of their lives was being subjected to forced sexual relations. In ancient Greece, the master-slave relationship was not, in the modern sense, merely economic or social. It was also bodily possession. A master had absolute rights over his slave. He could make him work, punish him, sell him, or, worst of all, use him to satisfy his sexual desires. Male concubines were the most defenseless victims of this order. Historical sources provide many hints that especially young male concubines were often turned into objects of pleasure by their masters. This reality even seeped into the literature of the era. In certain plays and poems, the beauty of young slaves was praised, an indirect reflection of this darker side of society. It was not merely something hidden behind closed doors. Within the upper classes, it was nearly normalized. For concubines, the most horrifying aspect of this was their total helplessness. Resistance against a master was impossible. Defiance often meant severe torture or death. For this reason, male concubines were forced to submit to their master's demands. For many, nightfall came with the dreadful fear of being summoned. The sound of a knock on the door could mark the beginning of the most harrowing moments of their lives. Some masters did not merely exploit concubines for their own desires, they would also offer them to guests. This was seen both as a display of power and as a form of hospitality, For a male concubine, nothing could be more degrading. In that moment, he was no longer a human being, but reduced to the level of an object, no different from a wine cup or a basket of bread on the table. Among concubines, eunuchs suffered an even greater tragedy. Because they could never father children, they were seen as completely belonging to their masters. This made them both more trustworthy and more subject to exploitation. To a master, a castrated male concubine was a being with no chance of escape, no rights over his own life, and entirely available for use. The art and philosophy of ancient Greece attempted to veil this shadowed reality. In some of the poetry we read today, there are romanticized images of young men, but often behind this so-called romance lay coerced relationships. For concubines, there was no love, no devotion, only coercion and fear. From a psychological perspective, the constant sexual violence consumed concubines entirely. They had no control over their own bodies. This destroyed their identity, their self-worth, and their very sense of humanity. Over time, a male concubine would forget his own self and become nothing more than the shadow of his master. Some tried to endure by submitting quietly to this life. Others carried within them a silent rebellion. They whispered secret prayers, clung to memories of their free days, and sought solace in remembrance. Yet one unchanging truth haunted them. Their bodies belonged to their masters, and their souls slowly withered away. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of this sexual violence was its normalization within society. What we find monstrous today was, in ancient Greece, seen as a marker of status. For a wealthy man to own beautiful male concubines increased his prestige and power. In other words, this exploitation was not just an individual perversion, but a systemic reality. In their dark world, male concubines were often forgotten. Their suffering was not recorded. Their cries were never heard. History chose instead to celebrate the victories of masters and the ideas of philosophers. But today we know that behind the dazzling surface of that great civilization lay countless hidden tragedies. The sexual violence endured by male concubines was among the darkest of these tragedies. This is why their story is not only a shameful memory of the past, but also one of humanity. Lessons that must never be forgotten. Because if we forget, such suffering can be repeated, albeit in different forms. In ancient Greece, the life of male concubines was not limited to sexual exploitation. Violence and punishment marked nearly every moment of their existence. A slave or concubine was considered a half-human in the eyes of society. They had none of the rights that free citizens enjoyed. Their sole purpose was to serve their masters. If a male concubine failed in his duties, showed disobedience, or even made the smallest mistake, the consequences could be severe. Beatings were among the most common punishments. Whips made of thick leather or the blows of heavy sticks were a near daily routine. This violence was so normal that concubines often woke each morning wondering not if they would be flogged, but how many lashes they would receive that day. Some punishments were far harsher. If a male concubine attempted to escape, the penalties that awaited him upon capture were terrifying. It was common for masters to brand their feet with hot irons, shackle their hands in chains, or burn permanent marks onto their foreheads. These brands served as lifelong badges of shame, signs that they were slaves and nothing more. One of the most dreadful punishments was castration. If a concubine was accused of betrayal or deemed untrustworthy, castration was often the chosen sentence. This was not only a brutal physical mutilation, but a punishment that transformed the individual's entire existence. Afterward, they were no longer considered fully male nor fully human. For young concubines in particular, this practice left devastating psychological scars. Punishments were not always confined to private chambers. Public humiliation was another weapon used against male concubines. They could be stripped naked, whipped, or shamed in front of large crowds. These spectacles served not only to punish, but also to send a clear warning to other slaves. Obedience was the only path to survival. The violence was not only physical, but psychological. Masters frequently hurled insults at concubines, degrading them and denying their humanity. Over time, this broke down their sense of identity. Many came to see themselves as worthless, forgetting even that they were human beings. Some historical accounts describe how masters would deliberately pit concubines against one another. When one made a mistake, the task of punishment might be assigned to another slave. This destroyed any possibility of solidarity or trust among them, leaving each isolated and fearful. It was one of the most effective tools masters possessed, ensuring that slaves never united against them. Historians have learned about these punishments not only from written sources, but also from art. Ancient Greek vases depict scenes of slaves being whipped, revealing that such acts were not hidden behind closed doors. They were known and even accepted by society as part of everyday life. The most tragic reality was that concubines themselves began to see these punishments as normal. For a male concubine, being beaten, whipped, or humiliated became as ordinary as eating or drinking. There was no alternative life to imagine, no hope of freedom to cling to. Some surrendered completely, believing that obedience was the only way to survive. Yet others carried a silent fire of rebellion. A few attempted escape. Some harbored secret hatred for their masters. But most who dared to resist paid the ultimate price, with their lives. In the world of male concubines, violence was not merely punishment. It was a system of control, designed to break their spirits and turn them into silent, submissive tools. This system endured for centuries. The glorious temples, artistic achievements, and philosophical ideas of ancient Greece cannot be separated from these bloody and merciless truths. The tragedy of male concubines deepened within this structure of violence. Their cries echoed through the agora, their bones broke in chambers of torture, and their spirits faded away in silence. That is why, when we admire the shining face of ancient Greece, we must not forget the shadows where such horrific stories were buried. The life of a male concubine in ancient Greece might have seemed ordinary and simple from the outside, but in reality, each day was governed by strict rules, exhausting duties, and constant surveillance, a cycle that left little room for rest or hope. They awoke at dawn, not by choice, but at the command of their masters. Sleepless nights were common, since they often had to serve late into the evening, only to begin working again at first light. The first tasks of the day usually revolved around cleaning, sweeping houses, temples, or palace chambers, arranging beds, carrying water. These were all routine duties. In wealthier households or royal estates, male concubines would be sent to fetch water from fountains miles away. The heavy clay jars pressed into their shoulders, their exhaustion seeping into their very bones. Afterward came the personal needs of their masters. Some worked in the kitchen, preparing meals and setting tables. Others dressed their masters, combed their hair, and tied their sandals. Those serving in higher positions were entrusted with personal belongings, documents, or even private chambers. By midday, many concubines were forced into field labor. They pruned olive trees, harvested grapes, and carried heavy loads under the scorching sun. These tasks strengthened their bodies, yet broke their spirits, because no matter how hard they worked, freedom was never the reward. The chains remained the same. The younger male concubines were often tasked with direct service. They poured wine for guests, carried trays at banquets, and played music at gatherings. A single mistake, a dropped cup or spilled drink, could mean a beating. Fear shadowed every movement. Later in the day, concubines often tended to their masters' children, telling them stories, helping with lessons, or playing alongside them. For masters, the obedience of concubines was useful in raising disciplined children. But for the concubines themselves, it was simply another burden. Perhaps the harshest part of daily life was the enforced silence. They could not speak freely, voice opinions, or converse as equals with free citizens. Their role was to answer only when spoken to. Thus their lives passed in near total silence, a suppression of not just words, but of identity. Evenings brought no rest. When masters hosted guests, concubines were expected to serve tirelessly for hours. Some were made to entertain, singing, playing music, or dancing. While these tasks were less physically demanding, they carried a far deeper humiliation. When the night finally ended, concubines withdrew to their own quarters, usually small, dark, and airless rooms. Their beds were little more than mats of straw. Though they lived surrounded by wealth and splendor, their own place was always at the lowest level. Still, not all concubines lived under the same conditions. A few became favorites of their masters, granted better clothing, food, or privileges. But such favor was precarious. When a master's interest faded, the fall from grace could be harsher than the struggles of ordinary service. In the end, the daily life of a male concubine was built on labor, silence, and obedience. Each day repeated the same cycle, and hope was nowhere in sight. To the free citizens of Greece, they were invisible. Yet in truth, the grandeur of ancient Greece was built upon the shoulders of these unseen lives. And so, the daily routines of male concubines were not just a matter of chores and service, but part of a much deeper tragedy, one that reveals the hidden shadows behind Greece's celebrated legacy. In ancient Greece, life for male concubines often appeared dark and inescapable. Yet, like all human beings, they carried within themselves a spark of hope. No matter how hard it was suppressed, the dream of freedom could never be fully extinguished. Amid the monotony and cruelty of daily life, some concubines created secret worlds within their own minds. Some dreamed of breaking their chains one day and returning to the lands where they were born. For those who had been taken as children, home was reduced to a handful of faint memories, a few familiar faces, voices, or scents. And yet, even these fragments of memory were enough to help them endure. Others appeared to have accepted their fate, but still clung to the belief that by pleasing their masters, they might secure a better life. In rare cases, slaves in ancient Greece did gain freedom through loyalty or special skills. Though the chances were slim, the mere possibility of manumission kept their hope alive. But the greatest dream of all was escape. Stories whispered among the concubines spoke of slaves who had fled, found refuge in distant cities, and lived as free men. Whether these tales were true or not mattered little. They served as legends that kept the spirit of rebellion burning. Plans of escape were made in secret, routes discussed, harbor schedules observed, guards' movements noted. Yet reality was merciless. Most escape attempts ended in capture and brutal punishment. Some were shackled, others were flogged, and a few were executed publicly as a warning to the rest. For this reason, the dream of escape often remained just that, a dream too dangerous to pursue. Still, the concubines did not tie all their hopes to flight alone. Some quietly waited for their masters to grow old, knowing that certain men freed their slaves before death. Others placed their hopes in the constant wars of the Greek world. Wars often brought upheaval, and in the chaos, slaves could be seized as spoils or even set free. In such moments, fate itself could suddenly change direction. There were also hopes born in love and companionship. Among concubines, strong bonds sometimes formed. Two slaves might share their dreams with one another, offering strength and solace. For many, these friendships and hidden affections were a lifeline, a quiet defiance against a world that sought to strip them of their humanity. After all, no matter how tightly their bodies were chained, their hearts could not be bound. The most tragic truth, however, was that many of these hopes never came to fruition. As the years passed, dreams gave way to resignation, For countless concubines, life ended as it began, in chains, unseen and forgotten, and yet their hopes must not be underestimated. Without them, survival under such crushing conditions would have been impossible. Freedom, love, escape, or simply the promise of a better tomorrow, these small sparks lit even the darkest corners of their minds. This is why the story of male concubines is not only one of suffering, but also of resilience. They embodied the unbroken side of the human spirit. Though bound in chains in their dreams, they remained free.